Hi, pairs and spares. I've missed you. I really have. And I've thoroughly enjoyed studying, having the freedom to go anywhere I want to go. But when Dwayne asked me if I would consider doing this, he kind of wanted to stick with what we're doing in Sunday School Quarterly. So our lesson begins in Proverbs chapter 15, which means we've missed out on the first part of Proverbs and the introduction and all of that. And since our verses for this Sunday begin in chapter 15 and continue on through like chapter 22, this is a section of Proverbs that is credited to Solomon. And if you know me very well, you know I really question why we refer to Solomon as such a wise man. And this is the man who had how many wives and how many concubines? I mean, for all the verses in Proverbs that he mentions about a good wife and how a quarrelsome wife can destroy your life, I think about Solomon and think, well, if we multiplied that times 600, we would probably understand exactly what he was talking about. But I do want to talk about Solomon, and I want to talk about the wisdom that he has from God. So to do that, we need to go back to 1 Kings chapter 2. David was giving instructions to Solomon before David's death. And he says, be strong and be courageous like a man, and keep your obligation to the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, and to keep his statutes, commands, ordinances, and decrees. This is written in the law of Moses, so that you will have success in everything you do and everywhere you turn, so that the Lord will carry out his promise that he made to me. Because you see, Solomon's reign, Solomon's unification of Israel, and the fact that Israel was catapulted to a nation of influence and riches, were a completion of what God had promised to David. David was not allowed to build the temple. David was not allowed to carry Israel to the heights because his reign was bloody. He had united the kingdom militarily, and God wanted his kingdom to be one of peace. And so he promised David that he would fulfill that promise through his son. Verse 12, and we're still in 1 Kings chapter 2, we find that Solomon sat on the throne of his father David, and his kingdom was firmly established. This continues for the first part of Solomon's reign. In chapter 3 of 1 Kings, we find that Solomon was brought to power. He became the king. He finishes building the Lord's temple and his palace and the walls to protect the city. But in chapter 3 of verse 2, we hear, however, the people were sacrificing on the high places because until that time, a temple for the Lord's name had not been built. Solomon loved the Lord by walking in the statutes of his father David, but he also sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. So I read that and I thought, well, okay, we didn't have the temple yet. So Solomon is offering sacrifices in the place that were available. Was it right? No, it sort of made do with what they had. But it still doesn't display wisdom. In verse 7 of chapter 3, we find Solomon talking to God. And he says, Lord my God, you have now made your servant king in my father David's place. Solomon knew that he was completing through his reign God's promise to David. And so he says in verse, I believe that's 9, so give your servant an obedient heart to judge your people and to discern between good and evil. Solomon knew where his power came from. And he knew that to fulfill God's promise through him, he had to govern in a way that was pleasing to God, which meant that he needed to be a godly judge, to judge between right and wrong, to treat all people equal. And he says later on in verse 12, he said, I will therefore do what you have asked. God says to Solomon, I will give you a wise and understanding heart, so that there has never been anyone like you before and never will be again. In addition, I will give you what you did not ask for, both riches and honor, so that no man in any kingdom will be your equal during the entire life. If you walk in my ways, and please underline if in your Bible, because it's a conditional covenant. If you walk in my ways and keep my statutes and commands, just as your father David did, I will give you a long life. Well, we begin then at the end of chapter 3 with illustrations about how wise Solomon was, how he governed even regular, normal people in a way that expressed or showed a wisdom for justice for everyone. His administrative ability, the way he divided up the administration of his kingdom, the fact that he had peace, that Israel was united as one kingdom and they had peace. Chapter 4 and verse 29, it says, God gave Solomon wisdom, very great insight, and understanding as vast as the sand on the seashore. Solomon's wisdom was greater than the wisdom of all the people of the East, greater than all the wisdom of Egypt. He was wiser than anyone. And he mentions some examples. And he says his reputation extended to all the surrounding nations. And then scripture tells us that Solomon composed 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005. He had a knowledge of science and of nature. And it says people came from everywhere, sent by every king on earth who had heard of his wisdom, to listen to Solomon's wisdom. Solomon began his reign with an understanding of where his power came from, of where his ability to be above other men came from. It came from a direct gift from God. In 1 Kings chapter 8, Solomon, the temple has been completed. God's Ark of the Covenant has a permanent home in the city of his choice, which is Jerusalem. And in chapter 8 and verse 17, it says, it was in the desire of my father David to build a temple for the name of Yahweh, the God of Israel. And he promises to God, he gives this wonderful prayer of his desire to do exactly what God wanted him to do, to provide justice for the righteous and to reward people for their righteousness. And so he did all that. He did express wisdom. Chapter 4, let's go back. Chapter 4 of 1 Kings, verse 29. Chapter 4 and verse 29. God gave Solomon wisdom, very great insight and understanding as vast as the seashore. He was wise in what he asked. And the thing that, when I read Proverbs, the thing that's interesting to me is it is common sense. I mean, it's just common sense, some of the things that he writes. Better a little with the fear of the Lord than great treasure with turmoil. Isn't that the truth in our culture? And so I think, okay, Solomon was wise. God recognized him for his wisdom. And then I begin to look and I think, well, okay, it took 7 years to build the temple. The materials were provided by his father David. All Solomon had to do was put it together. All Solomon had to do was complete the task. And then we read that it took 13 years to build his palace. And so red flags go up, and I think, do we have a problem here? Are we beginning to have a problem? 1 Kings 11:11, and I just turned it back, so give me just a second. 1 Kings chapter 11 and verse 11. Look with me, if you will. We begin to see the unfaithfulness to God's plan. Then the Lord said to Solomon, since you've done this and did not keep my covenant and my statutes, which I commanded you, I will tear the kingdom away from you and give it to your servant. However, I will not do it during your lifetime because of your father David. Solomon had prayed for justice. He had promised obedience. And he didn't stick with it. He didn't complete the task. And so while we say Solomon was wise, on the other hand, Solomon left that wisdom behind and didn't always act in a wise way. And so when I read these middle sections, look at Proverbs start with verse 15, Proverbs chapter 15 and verse 33. He says something that just says it all for Solomon's life. He says, the fear of the Lord is what wisdom teaches. Had Solomon remained true to that idea of being wise and being just, he would have completed his task as a man. But the fear of the Lord is what wisdom teaches, and humility comes before honor. Maybe Solomon had the honor first, I don't know. But two objectives of this lesson: the fear of the Lord is what wisdom teaches, and humility comes before honor. Define fear of the Lord. I use this illustration all the time, and those of you in pairs and spares know this, but I fear horses. I'm amazed at people who are just so at one with a horse. I mean, you know, we go to these shows and I watch these cowboys talking on their phones on their horses, and they're just one with that being. But when I walk up close to a horse, I sense their magnificence and the fact that they could wipe me out with one quick kick. It's an awesome respect that I have for those magnificent animals. That's a silly illustration, but it does express fear of the Lord, an awesome respect for what God is in my life and for what He can do in my God's personhood. We would pray for wisdom and for knowledge, for discretion, to know what to do with that fear. We talked about Proverbs 10, chapter 10, verses 22 being Proverbs of Solomon. And so, we know Solomon knew what wisdom was. The fact that he didn't always live up to it may make him very similar to us. Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 22. The one who understands a matter finds success, and the one who trusts in the Lord will be happy, will be content. Chapter 18 and verse 10. The name of Yahweh is a strong tower. The righteous run to it and are protected. We need that in our culture. We need to know that God is not only the creator, but he is our refuge for whatever life throws at us. If we look at Proverbs chapter 22 and verse 4, the result of humility is fear of the Lord. When Solomon lost that humility, when his palace became larger and maybe more important to him than the temple, he lost that fear, that awesome respect of the Lord. The whole verse says the result of humility is fear of the Lord, along with wealth, honor, and life. To be fearful of the Lord, to be in honor of him is the most important idea. As Solomon grew older and as he looked back over his life, and when you read Song of Solomon's or Ecclesiastes, you kind of get this idea that because of his wisdom and because of his knowledge of the Lord and the tenets of the Lord, he knew the results. He knew the results of good and bad. He understood, he had an insight into good and bad behaviors. And so all of his wives, he knew the fear of the Lord. And I bet you at the end of his life, he wished he had walked all the way through his life, letting that be the dominant guide in his life. I can't help but go back thinking of our class and who we are. And there are some verses that just ring out to me. Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 31. Gray hair is a glorious crown. Love it. It is found in the way of righteousness. If we haven't figured it out by this time, I don't know if we ever will. And then in chapter 17 and verse 6, children are the crown of the elderly, the greatest joy of our lives. And then in chapter 20 and verse 29, this is a good one for us to end on. The glory of young men is their strength. That's very true. But the splendor of old men is gray hair. There is hope for all of us. There's a hope that as we walk through our lives, we maintain that fear of the Lord and that respect for the fact that whatever happens, God is in control. Thanks. We'll see you maybe next week. Let me know what you think.